Linda Bury was a lonely 17-year-old burdened by a life of poverty.
She cried when we had to move, but we had to because we were getting evicted.
Josh Mebane was a young man rebelling against a life of privilege and expectations.
He had a lot of resentment towards his dad. He could never do anything right.
When these two teenagers met online, their connection was immediate and intense.
They just could not keep their hands off of one another.
They had this fantasy of, we were meant to be.
But their all-consuming romance would be derailed by a brutal crime.
He sees this ball of flames coming out of a vehicle. The body was burned beyond recognition.
Now follow detectives as they hunt for a pair of cold-blooded killers.
This was such a depraved killing. It was essentially an execution.
And learn that this first murder was only the beginning.
Never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that not only one murder was going to be solved, but possibly two.
DC cops never saw this coming.
November 7th, 2012, Washington, D.C. At just after 9 p.m., a local man was taking his dog for a walk through an industrial part of the city when he came across something that stopped him dead in his tracks.
In the darkness, he sees this ball of flames coming out of a vehicle.
There was a taxi cab that had crashed and then had caught fire.
The man immediately called 911, and firefighters raced to the scene.
Firefighters did everything with their fingers crossed, hoping that there was nobody in that vehicle.
But once they were able to get the fire under control, their worst fears were confirmed.
They quickly realized there was still a body in the car in the driver's seat.
But what had caused the man's car to crash and then burst into flames? Had it been an accident, or had something more sinister ignited the flames? The answers would eventually reveal a smoldering tale of obsession, murder, and the story of a young romance gone horribly awry. Born in 1995, Linda Bury was raised in Parkton, Maryland. The oldest of 3 children, her family struggled to make ends meet.
She grew up in a very poor family. In fact, one would call it abject poverty.
As children, Linda and her younger sister tried not to let their poverty get them down.
I would describe my sister as outgoing. Everybody would love her. Like, she's a loving person. We would go to karaoke nights and sing for people. The most thing I loved about her is she always gave me a hug when she woke up. Every time she woke up, before she went to school, she would give me a hug.
As Linda blossomed into a teenager, her outgoing personality was matched by her beauty.
She had long, dark hair, pale skin. Linda was an attractive young lady.
But Linda's good looks hid an overwhelming insecurity. Growing up poor hadn't bothered her as a child, but as a teenager, she had become painfully aware and ashamed of her family's poverty.
She was embarrassed about her clothes. She was embarrassed about the home she lived in.
Linda felt ostracized as a result, and her once effervescent personality began to fade.
She felt that she would not be accepted. She was so ashamed of who she was and where she came from that she wouldn't allow herself to meet people and to enjoy life.
Then, when Linda was 17, her life took a more tragic turn.
Her father was diagnosed with cancer.
It was really hard for her because that's our father, and she was like a daddy's girl.
Linda's family was unable to cover both the mortgage and expensive medical treatment, and they lost their house as a result. Linda's family ended up moving in with her aunt and uncle, who were much better off, but the upheaval left Linda feeling even more lost and out of place than she had before.
Linda was so unhappy with her life. She was just very depressed.
She was like, I don't want to be here, and she would leave and just sit outside and just get away from people for a while.
But Linda soon discovered there was one benefit to her new living arrangement. Her relatives had a laptop that Linda could use whenever she wanted, a luxury she'd never had access to outside her school before.
Her relatives, they had a computer, and this is where Linda first started indulging in social media.
She would be on her laptop a lot, looking at Facebook, MySpace, Meet Me.
Social media provided Linda with the perfect way to escape her unhappy reality. Online, no one knew who Linda was or where she came from.
The internet allowed her to hide the fact that she didn't have the clothes that she wanted, that she didn't have money.
That gave Linda the courage to venture into the world of online dating. Her hope was to find new guys without feeling insecure. She also secretly fantasized about meeting the right guy who could rescue her from her miserable life.
A white knight was going to come and save her from her circumstances and just sweep her off her feet and make it all okay.
Linda's profile picture quickly drew her plenty of attention from potential suitors, but one boy in particular caught her eye. 17-year-old Joshua Mebane.
They met on a dating site called Meet Me.
He's tall, dark, with angular features, and he's an attractive young man.
Like Linda, Josh had grown up in Maryland, but his childhood had been different. Raised in the affluent neighborhood of Waldorf, he'd never experienced financial hardship.
Mr. Mebane lived solid, comfortable, middle-class life. No outward appearance of anything amiss in the house. Creature comforts, didn't want for anything as far as the eye could see.
His father was a sound director. His mother was a working professional.
But for Josh, a life of privilege wasn't quite as easy as it appeared.
From the outside, it may have looked like Josh's life was the perfect life. To Josh, it really wasn't.
When it came to school and Josh's future, he didn't feel he lived up to what was expected of him. And no matter how much he accomplished, Josh felt like he was always falling short.
He had a lot of resentment. He could never do anything right.
Josh's relationship with his family got even worse when his parents unexpectedly filed for divorce. Josh blamed the split on his father's strict rules.
Joshua decided to do the polar opposite of whatever his father directed him to do.
Josh was in a deep state of rebellion. He just loathed being dependent on his parents. If he needed something, that's the last place he'd ever turn.
Rather than studying or pursuing summer internships, he started hanging out with kids from the wrong side of the tracks, and he began experimenting with drugs.
He really wanted to be the bad boy. He could make his own decisions. He could live the life he wanted to live.
Josh also tried to cultivate his new rebellious image online. On social media, Josh could pretend to be as tough as he wanted to be, and his new persona drew lots of attention from the opposite sex.
Being that bad boy, being seen as strong, having people be fearful can be attractive.
It was especially attractive to 17-year-old Linda Bury. Even though she didn't know that he came from a background of privilege, Linda saw Josh as the kind of bold young man she dreamed about running away with.
You can just see how, maybe from her point of view, that Josh Mebane was something like a lifeline. Josh could be her way out of a troubled home life, and that he represented the path to a better life.
Linda and Josh exchanged messages for hours every day. A surprising shift in behavior that alarmed Linda's sister, especially when she caught a glimpse of the reckless, tough guy image Josh was trying to project.
I was telling her to get off the computer, stop talking to him, because he looked like trouble, and she would tell me to get out.
The more Josh and Linda spoke online, the more Josh's persona began to fade, and the more they confided in one another. For the first time, Josh talked about his difficult relationship with his family, while Linda opened up about her family's problems. In their honesty, the teenagers found a new common ground.
Linda and Josh had one thing in common. Neither one of them were completely happy with the life that they had.
In some ways, you can kind of see how this was a perfect storm. It may be a reflection of how much promise they thought the other person had for them, how much these two were fated to be together, this fantasy of we were meant to be, and if we just get together and if we can just get away, everything will be fine.
It was a belief that Josh and Linda both shared deeply, so much so that even though they'd only known each other for a week, Josh told Linda he was coming to see her.
Josh gets into a cab and takes a 2-hour ride down to Parkton, Maryland, to meet Linda for the first time.
And when the couple finally met face to face, they realized the spark they felt online was nothing compared to their intense physical connection.
She feels a very strong attraction to him. Perhaps that came out of a false sense of intimacy that they developed online very, very quickly. But again, they're teenagers, and hormones can make you feel like an instant connection very quickly.
The couple couldn't wait to be alone. But Linda's house wasn't an option. So they decided to rent a room in nearby Washington, D.C., where they could explore their passion in private.
They could barely make it to the bed. It was sex, and it was lust, and it was everything that they had been hoping and thinking about.
Josh lavished Linda with attention, making her feel accepted for who she was for the first time in her life.
This night wasn't just any night for Linda. She found it to be something very important in her life. This was her first romantic sexual experience. And it couldn't be just a hookup in that context. For Linda, it was a whole lot more.
For the next 6 days, the lovers stayed holed up in their motel room, indulging their every desire.
It's nothing but sex, sleep, eat, come up for air.
The couple also spent their time fantasizing about running away and starting a new life together. Josh told Linda he already had the perfect place in mind.
Joshua would regale Linda with stories about going away to someplace cold. You know, he was obsessed with Iceland. And to Linda, that was an exotic place.
Josh wanted to visit Iceland. And so when he met Miss Bury, that was one of the things that he expressed to her. She was persuaded by his affection for it, and she adopted it as her own goal.
Making that dream come true, however, wouldn't be easy. Josh didn't want to go to his parents for money. And until they could figure out how to afford a future, Linda and Josh were happy spending their time together in bed. But the lovers' happiness wouldn't last. A grim series of events was about to unfold. Events that would unleash a terrifying crime and leave people wondering if the root of Josh and Linda's yearning was a desperation that had turned deadly. Coming up, evidence at the crash site suggests that this fire was no accident.
There's a bullet hole through the back of the head.
And a surprise visit from police shocks Linda's family.
I was crying my eyes out because I wouldn't think she'd be involved in kind of thing like that.
Linda Bury and Josh Mebane were two teenagers who both felt out of place in the world until they found each other online.
When they got together and they were actually face to face, it was all about passion.
She felt a connection to Josh, something that to her was very deep and meaningful.
But while the young lovers were enjoying their new romance, police investigators in nearby Washington, D.C. were responding to an urgent 911 call.
A cab had run off the road, caught fire, the driver was dead.
So far, detectives didn't know anything for sure. The taxi had been so badly damaged, not even the source of the fire was immediately clear.
There were no eyewitnesses to the actual offense. There were no sources that we were able to find that had any firsthand knowledge of what occurred.
They can't make a determination of whether it was man-made or it was caused by the impact of the car.
They had to figure out how it happened and what happened. Was this carelessness, an accident, or something else?
Investigators gave the body to the medical examiner, hoping an autopsy would be able to shed more light on the cause of the crash. According to the ME's preliminary examination, the driver's death was definitely not an accident.
There's a bullet hole to the back of the head.
It clearly was fired from somebody at close range, directly behind the victim. This was a homicide.
It appeared the driver had been shot from the back seat, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. Police knew that being a DC cab driver came with some unfortunate risks that might suggest a motive for the crime.
This is DC, and there have been numerous cases where DC cab drivers get shot and killed.
Cab drivers are, unfortunately, an easy target. They suffer robberies, they suffer assaults, they suffer all manner of disrespect, but rarely are they killed in such a cold-blooded fashion.
Was this murder the result of a botched robbery? In order to determine the true motive for the crime, police needed to first determine who the cab driver was. Unfortunately, the body had been so badly damaged by the fire, the ME was unable to make an identification.
He was unrecognizable. They couldn't figure out an identity based on the burns to his body.
In need of more evidence, investigators turned back to the crime scene, and in searching the surrounding area, they found a new potential clue on the ground.
There was a light blue glove, and there was a black latex glove. And they were thrown on the ground only a few feet from the burning cab, in plain view.
Latex gloves weren't something police would expect to typically find discarded on the street.
They knew it was possible that those gloves had been worn by the killer to cover up his crime.
If the killer had worn these gloves to hide their fingerprints, was it possible they also left a trace of their DNA inside? To find out, detectives sent the gloves off for analysis. In the meantime, they turned their attention back to the burned remains of the cab. Investigators were able to determine that the fire started in the engine compartment as a result of the crash. A valuable piece of evidence was also pulled from the wreckage.
Miraculously, the driver's wallet survived the fire.
That wallet was intact with everything inside of it, including identification.
The victim's name was Mohammed Qadir. Detectives verified that the burned-out cab was registered in his name.
Mr. Qadir was a 42-year-old native of Pakistan. He had been in the district for approximately 17, 18 years, married, beautiful wife, 2 sons. He was working in the city 7 days a week to put food on the table, clothes on his kids' back.
The contents of Mohammed's wallet also suggested that whatever his killer had wanted, it wasn't money.
In addition to his identification, there was cash in his wallet.
This could have been a robbery because Mr. Muhammad still had his money.
But if Mohammed wasn't the victim of an armed robbery, why was he killed? Investigators turned to his wife, hoping they would have some idea why he might have been targeted.
She was inconsolable. She was clearly destroyed. Could not believe the news.
This is a man who took care of his family. This is a man who went to work every day in his cab.
His reputation was one of immense generosity. From all accounts, he was a wonderful man.
Mohammed's fellow cab drivers told detectives the same thing. He was well-liked, reliable, and went out of his way to help people.
He didn't really have any enemies. In fact, people who worked with him, they adored him.
He's just a very humble guy who was trying to make a living for his family.
Who would possibly want to harm him? How did he end up in that vehicle, engulfed in flames with a bullet wound to the head?
While police struggled with those questions, the city of Washington, D.C. reeled from the news of the unexplained murder. Meanwhile, temporary residents Linda Bury and Josh Mebane were holed up in a Washington, D.C. hotel room. The teenage lovers had been at the hotel for nearly a week, but they were running low on funds. Josh, who'd paid for the room with his personal savings, was almost out of cash, and the couple now faced the unfortunate reality that without more money, they'd both have to return to their depressing home lives and put their dreams of running away to Iceland on hold.
So at some point, reality does kick in. They realize they don't have the money to pay for the hotel, they don't have the money to pay for food, they gotta do something.
But while Linda and Josh prepared for the painful reality of having to split apart and go back to their families, DC police were trying to track down new leads in the puzzling murder of Mohammed Qadir.
The DC homicide detectives get a call from the Baltimore County Police Department, and they're conveying a tip.
Someone there had reported that they had information about a murder of a cab driver that had happened in DC.
Coming up, investigators get their first lead in the fatal shooting. But will it lead to a suspect or two?
I'm like, why are they taking my sister? What is going on?
Linda Bury and Josh Mebane had known each other for less than a week before sharing 6 nights of lust in a DC motel room. And while their time together had been brief, that didn't stop them from dreaming about their future.
They wanted to go to Iceland to start their lives again in a completely different world.
They just wanted to be together, and then they would figure it out along the way.
But while Linda and Josh were swept up in their teenage romance, detectives in Washington, D.C. were in the midst of a murder investigation. On November 7th, 42-year-old taxi driver Mohammed Qadir had been found shot to death inside his burning taxi cab.
It's an execution-style murder. It's one shot to the back of the head, bang.
But who would want to kill this hard-working husband and father, and why? Investigators finally got the break they'd been looking for when a tip came in from a Baltimore woman who said she had information that might be related to the case. The woman told police that her 2 teenage nieces had been living with her since their family had been evicted from their home. And she believed that the older girl, a 17-year-old, might be connected to the murder of the DC cab driver. Her name was Linda Bury. Linda's aunt told police that the events that led her to suspect her teen niece began a week earlier, when Linda mysteriously disappeared.
I woke up, she wasn't there, and there was a bag gone. So I went down and knocked on my parents' door and told Linda's gone, and we ended up calling the cops.
At the time, Linda's family had no idea where she might have gone, but her sister believed she knew exactly who Linda was with, her new boyfriend, Josh Mebane.
I thought she was with him, like she ran away with him.
6 days later, the teenager had suddenly shown back up.
I saw her on the couch and I jumped on her and gave her a hug. And then my mom came home and my mom just hugged her and didn't let her go. We were happy to see her.
Linda had admitted she'd been with Josh since she left, and they'd been staying in a Washington, D.C. hotel. But her aunt told police that Linda had later confided in her that while she and Josh had been in D.C., they'd been involved in a troubling event.
She indicates that there was an incident that happened during a cab ride.
Linda wouldn't say what the incident was, other than it had disturbed her. But when Linda's aunt saw the news about the cab driver shooting, she immediately feared the worst.
The severity of it meant she needed to pass this along. So she called the Baltimore County Police Department, and she advised them of what Linda Bury had told her.
Had Linda Bury and her boyfriend been involved in Mohammed Qadir's shooting? In the hopes of getting some answers, investigators decided to bring Linda in for questioning. But once detectives sat down with Linda, she denied her aunt's story and claimed she never said anything about an incident with a cab driver.
She pretty much says that she doesn't know what they're talking about, they've got the wrong person.
Linda admitted that she'd run away to D.C. with her boyfriend that week, but they definitely hadn't been anywhere near the scene of a murder. In fact, she said she and Josh had spent the entire time holed up in their motel room having sex. But she and Josh had eventually run out of money and were forced to return to Maryland.
They actually go to Joshua's mom's house in Waldorf.
His mother hasn't seen him in several days and was very frantic about his well-being. And so he knocks on the door. His mother opens the door, and there he is standing with some strange girl that she had never seen.
Joshua's mom was less than thrilled to meet the new girlfriend. She insisted on driving Linda back home to Parkton.
Linda told police she was heartbroken to be separated from Josh and had spent all her time in her room crying since her return from D.C. She said she had no idea why her aunt called police or told them she knew about a murder. Was Linda telling the truth? To find out, police contacted Josh Mebane at his parents' house in Waldorf. He confirmed Linda's story. The lovers had spent the week in D.C. and returned the previous day. He didn't know anything about a shooting either. Had Linda's aunt misheard what she'd told her and simply saw a connection where there was none? To detectives, it was possible, and there was no physical evidence tying either Linda or Josh to the crime. But a gut instinct told the investigators that the young lovers must be hiding something.
Here was a family member who had absolutely no reason to lie, saying that Linda and her boyfriend were involved in an incident with a cab driver.
In an effort to determine what really happened during Linda's trip to D.C., police secured a search warrant for her aunt's house where she'd been staying.
They were looking for cab receipts, blood stains on her clothing, or anything else that could connect her to that crime scene.
When they read us the warrant, I was crying my eyes out because I wouldn't think she'd be involved in kind of thing like that.
At first, investigators were unable to turn up any evidence linking Linda to the cab driver or the shooting. But just as they were about to leave, they stumbled onto something that would break the case wide open.
What they do find is a pair of jeans with a note inside the pocket.
Coming up, a shocking message puts Linda and Josh in detectives' sights.
When she laid eyes on that note, she froze.
But just as police think they've solved the crime, a new revelation turns the case upside down.
She tells detectives, actually, there's more, and this is a bombshell.
Linda Bury and Josh Mebane were two teenagers from different worlds who shared a deep connection.
Linda and Josh had one thing in common. Neither one of them were completely happy with the life that they had.
The couple had run away together for a week full of passion in a motel room. But their tryst had been cut short when they ran out of money. And now they were both suspected in the unsolved shooting of a DC cab driver. Linda and Josh had both denied any knowledge of the murder. But detectives had just found a clue in Linda's bedroom that suggested otherwise.
Inside the right pocket of Miss Bury's skinny jeans was a note. It was on a torn white piece of paper.
And what was written on the note immediately caught their attention.
We should have took the dude's money. That's what the note says.
Detectives wondered, was Mohammed Qadir the dude referred to in the note? Armed with this new discovery, police took Linda into custody. They also confronted her with the note, and her reaction seemed to tell them everything they needed to know.
They dropped that note on the table in front of her.
She froze. She said nothing.
The young woman who'd easily handled their questioning hours earlier suddenly lost all her bravado.
Linda knew she was busted.
Linda tearfully told detectives that when she and Josh ran out of money, neither one of them could stomach the thought of going back home or of leaving each other.
They had cultivated this bond, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep it going.
They didn't have any money. What were they going to do?
Linda said they'd brainstormed about how to come up with some fast cash. But for two underage runaways, their options were limited. Linda told police that's when Josh came up with an idea.
Joshua suggested, why don't we just rob a cab driver?
Josh reasoned that a cab driver would be an easy target, bound to have plenty of cash on hand. And Linda told police that when she asked Josh how he was going to pull off the robbery, he surprised her by revealing that he already had a weapon.
Josh displayed a 9mm handgun.
Linda said Josh told her he'd bought the handgun several months earlier from a private seller online. He assured Linda that he'd take care of everything. All she had to do was go along for the ride.
Linda did not want to go home. She wanted to stay with Josh. He was her hero. He was going to make her dreams come true.
So on the evening of November 7th, Linda said she and Josh put his plan into action. Linda told police she and Josh walked to a nearby street where they hailed a cab. But before getting in, Josh made sure the driver, Mohammed Qadir, had enough money to make it worth their while.
Josh asked the cab driver, well, can you break a 50? And of course he says yes.
They knew he had at least that much money.
Linda said that after they got into the cab, Josh asked Mohammed to drive them to a remote location near an empty school.
So they drive up there and Joshua tells the driver, yeah, can you just bring us around back?
As Mohammed pulled around the building to drop them off, Linda claimed Josh got ready to spring his trap.
He reaches into a small duffel bag that he's been carrying the entire time that he's been with Miss Bury.
Linda sees him putting on 2 latex gloves.
And he withdraws from this small bag a 9mm pistol.
Linda told police that she got cold feet when Josh pulled the gun out.
Linda says at this point she pulls her hood over her head because she really doesn't want to see what he's going to do next.
Josh told Mohammed he was going to pay with the $50 bill he'd mentioned earlier. But as Mohammed reached for his wallet to make change, he got a surprise instead.
He had raised the pistol up and pointed it, leveled it at the back of Mr. Qadir's head and pulled the trigger.
Linda told investigators she was shocked. As far as she knew, the plan had simply been to rob the cab driver.
She had no idea that Josh was going to murder anyone.
But Linda said that wasn't the only thing that didn't go according to plan.
Once the driver is shot, his foot hits the gas pedal, his head hits the horn. The car leaps forward, everything is going nuts, and then there's an impact with a tree.
The car had swerved off the road and crashed. Linda and Josh were unharmed, but they quickly realized the cab had caught fire.
They had to get out really quick. They just jumped out the cab and ran.
And in the chaos, they forgot to take the very thing they'd come for.
They didn't even try to even get the wallet off Mohammed.
No money was taken. No money was exchanged.
Basically, the two of them committed this crime and took a life for nothing.
With no money and fearing they'd be discovered, Josh and Linda fled the scene. They hitchhiked back to Josh's home in Maryland.
They committed this crime because they wanted to get money so they could run away together. But there they were. They had nothing.
It was a shocking story, but detectives wondered, was Linda telling the truth? Or was she trying to minimize her involvement by blaming the murder entirely on Josh? So far, her story seemed to line up with the clues found at the crime scene.
It's matching up with all the evidence that they've collected. She talks about the latex gloves.
Was Linda really an innocent bystander, or had she been Josh's willing accomplice? Before detectives could press her for more details, Linda shocked them with another revelation.
She tells detectives, actually, there's more. And this is a bombshell.
What Linda said next, DC cops never saw coming.
Linda told police that while she and Josh were holed up in the motel room, they told each other all of their secrets. And Josh's turned out to be far darker than she'd ever expected. Linda said Josh confessed to her that a week before they met, he'd taken a walk through his neighborhood in Waldorf, and he'd taken his newly acquired 9mm handgun with him. Josh had told Linda that the gun gave him a feeling of power and control like he'd never known. While he was out, Josh told her he came upon a couple walking together and claimed he'd been overcome by an uncontrollable desire to see what it would be like to use the deadly weapon.
Suddenly, Joshua turns around and shoots both the couple. Just boom, boom. He didn't take any money. He just shot him for no apparent reason.
He was trying to prove himself to be tough.
So he explained to Miss Bury what he had done in a rather braggadocious manner.
Linda said Josh told her that the woman had died, but her husband survived and helped police put together a composite sketch of Josh. He'd even shown the drawing to Linda.
He asked her to tell him whether or not he thought it looked like him, because I think he thought that was making some sort of impression on her.
But even though there was a police sketch of his likeness, Josh hadn't been ID'd as a suspect. Police had no idea how to find the shooter. And getting away with murder had made him feel even more powerful.
You could see how somebody who wants to feel dominant, somebody who wants to feel strong, that for them, murder is sort of the ultimate in proving that.
DC police checked out Linda's story with homicide detectives in Waldorf and quickly confirmed the shooting did occur. Investigators were stunned.
Never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that not only one murder was going to be solved, but possibly two.
On November 9th, 2012, police arrested Josh Mebane for suspicion of murder in both the shooting deaths of Mohammed Qadir and the woman in Waldorf.
Unlike Linda, once Josh was in custody, he was less than cooperative. He wasn't giving up anything. He shut down immediately.
But a search of Josh's home gave investigators all the evidence they needed.
Unbeknownst to Joshua, while he was not giving it up, his house was. Inside Joshua's house, they find the bag that was used, the clothing that Linda described that he was wearing the night of the crime, receipts from the hotel, and of course, the 9mm gun.
Between the gun and Linda's statement, police were confident their case against Josh Mebane was strong. But little did they know that their investigation was about to be turned upside down. Coming up, prosecutors get hit with a bombshell that threatens their entire case.
If you hear about someone who's gunned down 3 people, didn't seem to have any true motivation, how could a sane person do that?
And Josh's defense team introduces a startling new argument.
Their theory is that Linda was the mastermind.
Linda Bury and Josh Mebane were 2 teen lovers accused of killing a Washington, D.C. cab driver. Linda had also implicated Josh in another D.C. area double shooting.
They've been together for maybe, at most 2 weeks, and then they're both charged with murder.
Linda had agreed to testify against Josh in exchange for a reduced sentence. But shortly after they made a deal with Linda, prosecutors learned that there might not even be a trial. As Josh's court date approached, his attorneys revealed a surprising defense. They claimed that Josh had clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Otherwise, he would have never committed such heinous acts.
The defense was presenting an insanity defense.
Josh Mebane had a mental illness and was not competent to stand trial.
Given the shocking nature of the crimes, prosecutors feared the argument might gain traction with the judge.
If you hear about someone who's gunned down 3 people and didn't seem to have really any true motivation, how could a sane person do that?
But a court-ordered psychological exam found Josh to be competent. And in August of 2015, the now 20-year-old stood trial for the murder of Mohammed Qadir. Prosecutors immediately called their star witness, Linda Bury, and it was clear to the courtroom that her feelings for Josh had cooled in their time spent behind bars.
Throughout the entire hearing, she was very fidgety. She looked very uncomfortable. She's kind of keeping her head down, and her hair is kind of in her face.
She never looked at Joshua in the eye.
Josh's affection for Linda, though, was still evident, even as she testified against him.
This young man really still had an affinity for Linda. He watched her closely. He was fixated on her the entire time.
Josh's defense team, however, didn't view Linda Bury with the same endearment. When it came time to cross-examine the state's star witness, the defense unveiled a shocking theory.
Their theory is that Linda was the mastermind.
The defense claimed that Linda had been driven to kill by her desperation to escape her life of poverty. They said she was lonely, friendless, and was obsessed with running away with Josh. She would have done anything to escape her old life, even if that meant killing an innocent cab driver.
She was willing to do anything to stay with Josh. She was just that desperate.
The defense claimed Josh's mental illness caused him to follow Linda's lead without asking questions. It was a surprising argument.
That's all that the defense had. She was the one who shot the taxi cab driver.
But the prosecution countered with dramatic new evidence. Crime lab analysts had finished their examination of the latex gloves found at the crime scene, and the results proved decisively who was wearing them when Mohammed Qadir was murdered.
The lab was presented with both the gloves and the DNA sample from Mr. Mebane, and they concluded that the DNA profiles from the gloves and the sample from Mr. Mebane were a match.
It only took 1 hour of deliberations for the jury to reach a verdict. They found Josh Mebane guilty on all charges.
Joshua Mebane was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
Under her plea deal with prosecutors, Linda Bury received only 6 years in prison, a short sentence that stunned most courtroom observers. But even with Mohammed Qadir's killers behind bars, one question remained. How could the dreams of two passionate teenagers take such a dark and deadly turn?
They wanted to be together, and they were willing to do absolutely whatever to make it happen.
When she gets out, I'm hoping she don't go back down the wrong road again. I hope she opened her eyes up in jail, seeing that he was a bad person, and that she won't go back to another person like that.
Before we begin, imagine walking through a university campus on a quiet spring morning. Students drift between lectures with books tucked beneath their arms. Conversations echo softly through wide courtyards. And the rhythm of ordinary academic life unfolds almost unnoticed. Universities are often thought of as places where the future is built one lecture at a time, where young people debate ideas, prepare for careers, and quietly believe that tomorrow will arrive much like today. It is difficult to imagine violence entering such a place without warning. Yet history occasionally reminds us that tragedy does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in complete silence. On the morning of May 9th, 1997, that silence settled over Sapienza University of Rome, one of Europe's oldest and largest universities. Within moments, an ordinary day became one of Italy's most enduring criminal mysteries. A 22-year-old law student named Marta Russo was walking across campus with her friend, Yolanda Ricci. There was nothing remarkable about the moment. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing hinted that within seconds, the lives of countless people, including investigators, judges, journalists, legal scholars, and the Italian public, would become permanently intertwined with a case that, decades later, would still provoke disagreement and uncertainty. Those who witnessed the scene did not immediately understand what had happened. Marta suddenly collapsed. To those nearby, it appeared as though she had fainted or perhaps suffered a sudden medical emergency. There was confusion rather than panic. No obvious attacker fled the scene. No loud confrontation had preceded her collapse. There was no visible weapon. There were no screams identifying a gunman. The campus continued to exist in that strange moment between normality and catastrophe, when people have not yet realized that history has changed around them. Only after Marta was transported to the hospital did doctors uncover the devastating truth. She had not collapsed because of illness. She had been struck in the head by a .22 caliber bullet. The discovery transformed what initially appeared to be a medical emergency into a homicide. Investigation unlike any Italy had seen in recent years. Suddenly, an unsettling question demanded an answer. Who could have fired a shot into a crowded university campus without anyone clearly seeing the shooter? The mystery deepened almost immediately. Marta remained in a coma for 5 days. Doctors fought to save her life, while investigators raced to understand what had happened before valuable evidence disappeared. On May 14, 1997, Marta Russo died from her injuries. Her death shocked the nation. Universities are often symbols of knowledge, debate, and opportunity. They are not places where students expect to become victims of unexplained gun violence. The contrast between the peaceful setting and the fatal outcome made the tragedy impossible to ignore. Newspapers across Italy covered every development. Television programs followed the investigation closely. Public attention intensified because the crime appeared to defy common sense. There was no apparent robbery, no known personal dispute, no obvious target. Why would someone shoot a young law student walking across campus in broad daylight? That question would haunt investigators for years, and even after the courts delivered their final judgments, it would continue to echo through Italian journalism and legal scholarship. Most criminal investigations begin with something tangible. A weapon recovered at the scene. Fingerprints left behind. DNA evidence linking a suspect to the crime. Surveillance footage. Eyewitnesses who can confidently identify what they saw. In many homicide cases, these pieces gradually fit together until they form a coherent narrative. But the investigation into Marta Russo's death developed very differently. As detectives searched for answers, they encountered a growing list of absences. The firearm believed to have fired the fatal shot was never found. Without the weapon, ballistic comparisons became impossible. There were no fingerprints on a recovered gun because there was no recovered gun. There was no DNA tying an individual directly to the act of firing the weapon. No eyewitness reported seeing the actual moment the shot was fired. No one stepped forward claiming to have watched a suspect pull the trigger. The case quickly became one in which investigators would have to reconstruct events almost entirely through indirect evidence. Witness testimony and forensic interpretation. That reality would shape everything that followed. Investigators eventually focused on a room located on the second floor of the Department of Philosophy of Law. Certain forensic findings suggested that this room could have been the location from which the fatal shot originated. Particles believed to be gunshot residue were reportedly discovered on the windowsill, becoming one of the central foundations of the investigation. Based largely on this reconstruction, detectives narrowed their attention to a relatively small group of individuals who regularly used that room. As the months passed, 3 names emerged as the principal suspects: Giovanni Scattone, Salvatore Ferraro, and Francesco Liparota. Yet even as public attention increasingly centered on these individuals, another unsettling fact refused to disappear. Investigators had not established a convincing motive. According to the available evidence, none of the 3 men had a known personal conflict with Marta Russo. None were shown to possess an obvious reason to target her. The absence of a clear motive did not prevent legal proceedings from moving forward, but it ensured that questions would remain long after the courtroom battles ended. The uncertainty surrounding motive would become one of several issues repeatedly examined by journalists, legal commentators, and forensic experts in the years that followed. Another source of controversy emerged through the testimony of an important witness, Gabriella Aletto. During the investigation, her statements changed over time. Initially, she repeatedly maintained that she had seen nothing relevant. Later, following an extended interrogation, she stated that she had seen Giovanni Scattone and Salvatore Ferraro inside the room, believed to be connected to the shooting. Years afterward, recordings of portions of that interrogation attracted widespread attention because they appeared to show investigators placing intense pressure upon her, even warning that she herself could face accusations if she continued denying knowledge of the events. These recordings did not automatically invalidate her testimony, nor did they erase the court's conclusions, but they fueled continuing debate regarding the reliability of statements obtained under significant investigative pressure. Questions that seemed settled inside the courtroom began resurfacing in public discussion. Were the witness statements entirely reliable? Had investigators become too committed to one theory? Had alternative explanations received sufficient attention? These were not merely academic questions. They struck at the heart of how modern criminal investigations are conducted and how courts evaluate evidence when certainty remains elusive. The forensic evidence itself also became the subject of later scrutiny. The particles identified during the original investigation as gunshot residue formed a critical part of the prosecution's reconstruction of the crime. However, years later, independent experts questioned whether those particles necessarily originated from a firearm at all. Some argued that they could instead represent environmental contamination rather than residue from a discharged weapon. If that interpretation were correct, then one of the investigation's central assumptions, the location from which the fatal shot had been fired, would become considerably less certain. Once again, no definitive alternative explanation emerged, but the confidence surrounding the original reconstruction faced renewed examination. Such debates are not unusual in complex criminal cases. Advances in forensic science, evolving investigative standards, and renewed analysis often lead experts to revisit evidence that earlier generations considered settled. Yet relatively few cases maintain public attention for decades in the absence of newly discovered suspects or newly recovered physical evidence. The Marta Russo case became one of those exceptions. Legally, the proceedings reached their conclusion after multiple trials and appeals lasting nearly 6 years. Giovanni Scattone was convicted of manslaughter through gross negligence and sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in prison. Salvatore Ferraro was convicted for assisting in concealing the incident. Francesco Liparota was ultimately acquitted following the appellate process. In 2003, Italy's Court of Cassation issued the final judgment, bringing the legal proceedings to an end. From the perspective of the judicial system, the case was closed. Yet closure in law is not always identical to closure in public memory. Over the years, journalists, legal scholars, forensic specialists, and observers continued returning to the enormous body of case files, transcripts, expert reports, and testimony, rather than reopening the investigation in an official legal sense. They sought to understand whether every important question had truly been answered. Around 2020, this renewed interest reached a wider audience through the podcast series Polvora, Il Caso Marta Russo, created by ethicist Chiara Lalli and journalist Cecilia Sala, examining tens of thousands of pages of documentation, interviewing individuals connected with the case, and reassessing the evidence. The series encouraged listeners to revisit one of Italy's most debated criminal investigations with fresh eyes. It did not produce a new trial. It did not overturn existing convictions. Instead, It highlighted how a legal verdict and historical certainty are not always the same thing. The distinction is important. Courts must eventually reach decisions based upon the evidence presented before them. Historians, journalists, and scholars, however, often continue asking questions long after the courtroom lights have gone dark. The story you are about to hear exists precisely within that space. It is not the story of an officially reopened murder case. It is the story of a case that continued living in public debate because some believed significant uncertainties remained unresolved. Throughout this series, we will carefully distinguish between established facts, judicial findings, and later criticism. We will not invent motives where none were proven. We will not attribute guilt beyond what the courts determined, nor will we treat every later criticism as established truth. Instead, we will follow the evidence as it appeared, examine why investigators reached the conclusions they did, and explore why so many observers continued questioning those conclusions years later. At the center of every discussion, however, stands one undeniable fact that no controversy can erase. A 22-year-old law student named Marta Russo left for university on an ordinary May morning and never returned home. Everything that followed, the investigations, the trials, the appeals, the debates, and the reinvestigations, began with that irreversible loss. And nearly 3 decades later, the questions surrounding her death continue to challenge not only Italy's justice system, but also our broader understanding of certainty, evidence, and the difficult pursuit of truth. Long before her name became associated with one of Italy's most debated criminal cases, Marta Russo was simply a young woman pursuing a legal education at Sapienza University of Rome. At 22 years old, she represented what thousands of university students hope to become during that stage of life. Someone building a future through study, discipline, and ordinary daily routines. The available record tells us little about her private life beyond the essential facts. She was a law student. She attended one of Italy's most prestigious universities. And on the morning of May 9th, 1997, she was doing something so routine that it hardly seemed worthy of notice. She was walking across campus with her friend, Yolanda Ricci. There was no indication that the day would become anything other than another chapter in an academic semester. That very ordinariness would later become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. Some crimes unfold against a backdrop of escalating conflict or visible danger. Others emerge from situations already marked by violence. Marta Russo's story began with neither. It began with an ordinary walk between university buildings. That distinction matters because it shaped both the emotional impact of the tragedy and the enduring questions that followed. When violence erupts without warning, without an apparent target, and without an obvious motive, it challenges people's assumptions about safety itself. Universities are often viewed as environments where intellectual debate replaces physical confrontation, where disagreements are settled through conversation rather than force. Sapienza University embodied that ideal for generations of students. Founded centuries earlier, it had grown into one of Europe's largest academic institutions, welcoming thousands of students each day. On any given morning, its courtyards, pathways, lecture halls, and departmental buildings were filled with people moving from one class to another, discussing examinations, sharing notes, or preparing for the future. It was precisely because the campus symbolized education and opportunity that the events of May 9th seemed so deeply unsettling. Nothing in the known facts suggests that Marta expected danger as she walked beside Yolanda Ricci. There is no documented evidence of threats against her. No indication that she feared being followed. No record of an appointment that carried unusual risk. From every established fact available, she was participating in the routine rhythm of university life. That simple reality would later become one of the investigation's greatest challenges. Without evidence that Marta herself had been specifically targeted, investigators would struggle to answer the most basic question in any homicide inquiry. Why did this happen? The morning unfolded like countless others before it. Students crossed the campus. Faculty members prepared for lectures. Administrative staff attended to their responsibilities. And academic life continued according to its familiar schedule. Somewhere within that routine, Marta Russo and Jolanda Ricci walked together through the university grounds. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Witnesses later described confusion rather than immediate recognition of violence. Marta suddenly collapsed while walking. To those nearby, the scene did not immediately resemble the aftermath of a shooting. There was no clear report of someone witnessing a gun being fired. There was no immediate identification of an armed attacker fleeing through the campus. Instead, observers initially believed that Marta had fainted or perhaps suffered an unexpected medical emergency. Such assumptions were understandable. A person collapsing without warning in a crowded public place naturally leads many to think first of illness rather than gunfire, particularly within the setting of a university. The absence of an immediately recognizable act of violence delayed the realization that something far more extraordinary had occurred. Emergency assistance arrived, and Marta was transported to the hospital. At that stage, uncertainty still surrounded the cause of her collapse. Only after doctors conducted their examinations did the unimaginable become clear. Marta Russo had sustained a gunshot wound to the head caused by a .22 caliber bullet. The discovery instantly transformed the situation from a presumed medical emergency into one of Italy's most shocking criminal investigations. The revelation also raised an extraordinary series of questions. How could someone fire a weapon on a university campus without attracting immediate attention? Where had the shot originated? Why had no one clearly identified the shooter? Had the intended target truly been Marta Russo, or had something else occurred? Those questions emerged almost simultaneously with the medical findings, and they would continue to dominate discussion for years. While investigators began examining the university grounds and searching for physical evidence, doctors focused on saving Marta's life. For 5 days, she remained in a coma. Those days became a period of profound uncertainty, not only for her family and friends, but also for investigators attempting to reconstruct the events that had led to her injuries. Every hour carried both medical and investigative significance. As physicians fought to preserve her life, detectives worked to preserve evidence before memories faded and potential clues disappeared. Yet the central mystery remained unchanged. No obvious suspect emerged immediately. No weapon had been recovered. The circumstances surrounding the shooting remained almost entirely unexplained. On May 14, 1997, Marta Russo died from her injuries. Her death transformed an attempted murder investigation into a homicide case and intensified public attention throughout Italy. News organizations reported extensively on the incident because its circumstances seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A young university student had been fatally shot in broad daylight while walking across the campus of one of the country's most respected academic institutions. The location alone distinguished the crime from many other acts of violence. Universities occupy a unique place within public consciousness. They are environments associated with learning, intellectual curiosity, and personal growth. Violence occurring within such spaces often produces a particularly powerful emotional response, because it appears to violate expectations about where people should be safest. The death of Marta Russo, therefore, resonated far beyond the university community. Students across Italy questioned how such an event could occur inside an educational institution. Parents wondered whether campuses were as secure as they had always believed. Faculty members confronted the unsettling realization that ordinary academic life could be interrupted by an act of deadly violence that seemed to arrive from nowhere. As public concern grew, another factor deepened the sense of uncertainty. There appeared to be no immediately obvious motive. Investigators did not identify an established personal conflict involving Marta that could readily explain the shooting. Nothing in the known facts suggested that she had become involved in a dispute likely to lead to violence. Without an apparent reason for the attack, speculation naturally increased. But speculation alone could never substitute for evidence. Investigators therefore faced the difficult task of separating rumor from fact while under intense public scrutiny. Every homicide investigation seeks to answer several fundamental questions. Who committed the act? How was it carried out? And why did it happen? In Marta Russo's case, each of those questions presented unusual difficulties almost from the beginning. The identity of the shooter remained unknown. The precise reconstruction of the shooting depended upon evidence that would later become the subject of significant debate. The motive remained elusive throughout the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings. The result was a case in which uncertainty became almost as prominent as certainty. Yet amid the growing attention devoted to forensic evidence, investigative theories, and legal arguments, it is important not to lose sight of the individual whose death initiated the entire process. Marta Russo was not simply the subject of a criminal investigation or a name appearing in legal documents. She was a young law student whose education, ambitions, and future ended abruptly on a university campus during what should have been an ordinary day. Every procedural development that followed, the examination of physical evidence, the questioning of witnesses, the lengthy trials, the appeals, and the later re-examinations by journalists and scholars, originated from that single irreversible loss. As investigators began reconstructing the events of May 9th, they faced the immense challenge of determining where the fatal shot had originated. The campus itself became both a crime scene and a puzzle. Buildings that normally housed lectures and academic discussions suddenly became locations requiring forensic examination. Rooms, windows, and pathways acquired investigative significance. Detectives searched for physical traces capable of explaining what witnesses could not, because no one had clearly observed the shooting itself. Every piece of material evidence assumed heightened importance. The coming investigation would therefore depend heavily upon forensic interpretation and witness testimony, two forms of evidence that would later become central to both the prosecution's case and the controversy surrounding it. At this early stage, however, investigators could not know how many years their work would ultimately span or how intensely each conclusion would later be examined. They knew only that a young woman had died after being struck by a bullet while walking across a university campus, and that somewhere within the ordinary landscape of classrooms, offices, and academic buildings lay the explanation they desperately needed to find. The search for that explanation would gradually lead investigators toward a specific room within the Department of Philosophy of Law. A small group of individuals associated with that location, and a chain of reasoning that would shape one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern Italian legal history. Whether that chain of reasoning ultimately resolved the mystery or merely created new questions would become the defining issue of everything that followed. The death of Marta Russo immediately transformed Sapienza University from a place of higher education into one of Italy's most carefully examined crime scenes. What had appeared only hours earlier to be an ordinary campus filled with students moving between lectures suddenly became the focus of an investigation that demanded answers to questions no witness seemed capable of answering. Somewhere within the university grounds, a single shot had been fired. Somewhere, someone had discharged a .22 caliber firearm in broad daylight. Yet despite the number of people present on campus, investigators faced an extraordinary problem from the very beginning. They had no eyewitness who could describe seeing the fatal shot being fired. The incident seemed almost to exist without a visible beginning. By the time authorities fully understood that Marta Russo had suffered a gunshot wound rather than a medical emergency, the person responsible, whoever that individual might have been, was no longer present. No obvious trail pointed directly toward suspect. No recovered weapon immediately clarified the circumstances. The investigation therefore began not with certainty, but with reconstruction. Detectives needed to determine not only who might have fired the shot, but where the shot had originated in the first place. That task required investigators to think backward, starting with the victim and attempting to trace the invisible path of a single bullet through the physical environment of one of Europe's largest universities. Every building overlooking the area where Marta had collapsed became potentially significant. Every window facing the surrounding walkways demanded attention. Every room with a possible line of sight had to be considered. Rather than searching for a fleeing suspect identified by witnesses, investigators first had to identify the likely location for which the firearm had been discharged. This reconstruction would become the foundation upon which nearly every later conclusion rested. As forensic specialists examined the campus, they eventually focused their attention on a specific location, a reading room situated on the second floor within the Department of Philosophy of Law. Based upon the available evidence collected during the early stages of the investigation, detectives concluded that this room represented the most likely origin of the fatal shot. The conclusion did not arise from eyewitness testimony, but from the physical reconstruction of the shooting itself. Investigators believed the trajectory of the bullet was consistent with a shot fired from that particular area. Once that location became central to the investigation, every object inside the room assumed potential evidentiary value. Among the findings that attracted particular attention were particles discovered on the windowsill. These particles were identified during the investigation as suspected gunshot residue. At the time, their significance appeared substantial. If the particles truly represented residue left by a recently discharged firearm, they would strongly support the theory that the fatal shot had indeed originated from that window. In the absence of a recovered weapon or direct eyewitness testimony, such forensic findings naturally assumed tremendous importance. They were not simply another piece of evidence. They became one of the principal pillars supporting the investigators' reconstruction of the crime. The discovery allowed detectives to narrow an enormous investigative landscape into a much smaller and more manageable focus. Rather than examining every possible location across the sprawling university campus, attention increasingly centered on one room inside one department. That shift fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Once authorities accepted the reading room as the probable firing position, the next logical question became equally important: who had access to that room? Investigators began identifying individuals who regularly used or occupied the space. Instead of searching through thousands of students and university employees, detectives concentrated on a far smaller group. Approximately 25 people who frequently used the room came under closer scrutiny. This narrowing of the investigation illustrates how criminal inquiries often develop through elimination rather than immediate identification. Faced with limited direct evidence, investigators gradually reduce the number of possibilities until certain individuals emerge as subjects requiring more detailed examination. At this stage, however, being included within that smaller group did not establish guilt. It merely reflected the investigators' working theory regarding where the shot had originated. From there, Detectives sought evidence capable of distinguishing ordinary presence from criminal responsibility. As interviews continued and evidence accumulated, attention increasingly converged on three individuals: Giovanni Scattone, Salvatore Ferraro, and Francesco Liparotta. Their emergence as principal suspects marked a decisive turning point in the investigation. Yet even as public attention began focusing upon these names, investigators confronted a remarkable contradiction. None of the three men appeared to possess an obvious motive for killing Marta Russo. According to the available information, there was no documented personal conflict between them and the victim. No history of threats had been identified. No long-standing dispute connected them. None had known criminal records suggesting a pattern of violent behavior. In many homicide investigations, motive serves as an important bridge between opportunity and intent. Here, that bridge appeared largely absent. The absence of a clear motive did not prevent investigators from continuing their work, but it ensured that every subsequent conclusion would face particularly careful scrutiny. Without a persuasive explanation for why Marta Russo would have been targeted, the investigation increasingly depended upon forensic interpretation and witness testimony to explain not only how the shooting occurred, but also who might have been responsible. Investigators therefore intensified their efforts to reconstruct every movement inside the Department of Philosophy of Law during the relevant period. They examined who had been present, who had access to the reading room, and who might have possessed knowledge capable of clarifying the sequence of events. Because the actual discharge of the firearm had not been directly observed, even seemingly ordinary details acquired heightened importance. The timing of people's movements, their locations within the building, and their recollections of the day all became essential components of an increasingly complex investigative puzzle. Unlike cases in which surveillance footage or numerous eyewitnesses establish a relatively straightforward timeline, this investigation required authorities to piece together events from fragments that often lacked independent confirmation. Every statement had to be evaluated alongside the developing forensic reconstruction. Every physical finding needed to be interpreted within the broader context of the investigations. Working theory. As the inquiry progressed, detectives faced another challenge common to many complex investigations: determining whether the available evidence genuinely pointed toward a single coherent explanation or whether multiple interpretations remained possible. At that early stage, investigators believed the suspected gunshot residue strengthened their reconstruction of the shooting. If the particles found on the windowsill truly originated from a recently fired weapon, then the theory that the fatal shot came from the reading room appeared considerably more convincing. This reasoning allowed investigators to focus their resources more efficiently. However, because the weapon itself had not been recovered, the forensic evidence necessarily carried greater weight than it otherwise might have. There could be no ballistic comparison between the bullet and a firearm because no firearm had been found. There could be no fingerprint examination of the weapon. There could be no DNA recovered from a gun linking a particular individual to its use. Consequently, each remaining piece of evidence assumed amplified significance. The investigation became increasingly dependent upon interpretation rather than direct physical proof. That reality would later become one of the defining characteristics of the case and one of the principal reasons why it continued attracting attention long after the legal proceedings concluded. During these early investigative stages, however, detectives continued following the evidence as they understood it. Their task was not merely to identify potential suspects, but to establish whether sufficient evidence existed to support criminal charges. Every interview, every forensic examination, and every analytical step contributed to that objective. Public attention intensified as news organizations reported developments in the investigation. The Italian public followed the case closely, hoping that authorities would soon explain how a young university student had been fatally shot during what should have been an ordinary day on campus. Yet despite growing investigative focus, the central mystery remained remarkably resistant to simple explanation. The identity of those under investigation did not itself answer the most troubling questions. Why had the shot been fired? Was Marta Russo specifically targeted? Or had she become the unintended victim of an act whose original purpose remained unknown? If the shooting originated from the reading room, what circumstances inside that room could possibly explain such an event? These questions continued to hover over the investigation even as detectives narrowed their focus. The developing case increasingly rested upon a combination of physical reconstruction and human testimony, two forms of evidence that would soon become inseparable. Investigators had identified what they believed to be the most likely firing position. They had reduced the field of possible suspects from thousands to a relatively small number of individuals associated with that location. 3 names had emerged as central figures within the investigation. Yet the evidence still required interpretation, corroboration, and legal evaluation. It was at this point that witness testimony would begin assuming extraordinary importance. Among those questioned was Gabriella Aletto, a secretary whose statements would eventually become some of the most discussed and controversial evidence in the entire case. Her evolving testimony, together with the continuing reliance upon forensic interpretation and the unresolved absence of both a weapon and a clear motive, would transform the investigation from a difficult homicide inquiry into one of the most intensely debated criminal cases in modern Italian judicial history. The search for the truth was no longer focused solely on discovering who had fired a single shot. It had become a broader examination of how investigators interpret uncertain evidence, how witnesses respond under prolonged questioning, and how an entire criminal case can come to depend upon the fragile intersection between physical traces and human memory. As the investigation progressed beyond its earliest forensic reconstruction, the challenge facing detectives became increasingly clear. They had developed a theory about where the fatal shot had most likely originated. But a theory alone could never sustain a criminal prosecution. To transform suspicion into a legal case, investigators needed evidence capable of connecting specific individuals to that location at the critical moment and, ultimately, to the shooting itself. Yet the deeper they looked into the events of May 9th, 1997, the more they encountered a case defined not by overwhelming physical proof, but by unanswered questions. The investigation gradually shifted away from the campus itself and toward the people believed to have been closest to the room that investigators considered the likely source of the gunshot. Out of the approximately 25 individuals who regularly used the reading room within the Department of Philosophy of Law, 3 names steadily emerged as the primary focus of the inquiry: Giovanni Scattone, Salvatore Ferraro, and Francesco Liparotta. Their identification marked a decisive moment, but it did not resolve the central mystery. If anything, it introduced an entirely new set of questions. Unlike many homicide investigations in which suspects quickly become associated with obvious motives such as revenge, financial gain, jealousy, or long-standing personal conflict, this case presented no such narrative. According to the available evidence, none of the 3 men had a known personal relationship with Marta Russo that would explain why she would become the victim of a fatal shooting. Investigators found no documented history of disputes between them and the young law student. There was no established pattern of hostility, no evidence of previous threats, and no apparent reason why Marta would have been deliberately targeted. This absence of motive immediately distinguished the case from more conventional homicide investigations. While motive is not always legally required to secure a conviction, It often provides juries and judges with a coherent explanation of why a crime occurred. Here, investigators were forced to continue building their case without that explanatory foundation. The lack of a demonstrated motive became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation and would remain a source of debate throughout the years that followed. Because the investigation lacked both a recovered murder weapon and an obvious motive, physical evidence assumed extraordinary importance. Yet even here, the detectives confronted significant limitations. The firearm believed to have fired the fatal .22 caliber bullet was never recovered. This single fact influenced virtually every aspect of the investigation. Without the weapon, investigators could not conduct ballistic testing to determine whether markings on the bullet matched a particular firearm. They could not examine a recovered gun for fingerprints. They could not collect DNA from a weapon that no one had ever found. They could not determine how long the firearm had been owned, who had possessed it, or where it had gone after the shooting. In many homicide cases, the weapon itself becomes a silent witness, preserving traces that investigators later use to reconstruct events. In the Marta Russo investigation, that witness never existed. The gun simply disappeared from the evidentiary record. Equally significant was the absence of direct eyewitness testimony identifying the shooter. Although numerous people were present on campus that day, no witness reported actually seeing someone fire the fatal shot. This meant that investigators could not rely upon the type of immediate identification that often strengthens criminal prosecutions. Instead, the case increasingly depended upon indirect evidence. Detectives attempted to reconstruct what must have happened by combining forensic findings with witness recollections and the physical layout of the university buildings. Such reconstruction is a common investigative practice, particularly when crimes occur without direct observation. However, reconstruction necessarily involves interpretation. And interpretation always carries the possibility of competing conclusions. The more investigators relied upon interpretation rather than direct observation, the more carefully each assumption would later be scrutinized. Among the individuals questioned during the investigation, one witness would eventually become central to the prosecution's case and equally central to later controversy. Gabriella Aledo, a secretary associated with the department, initially told investigators that she had seen nothing relevant to the shooting. According to the investigative record summarized in later discussions of the case, she repeatedly maintained this position during the early stages of questioning. At that point, her statements offered no direct support for the investigators' developing theory regarding the reading room or the individuals who regularly occupied it. As the investigation continued, however, her testimony changed. Following a lengthy interrogation, Aledo stated that she had seen Giovanni Scattone and Salvatore Ferraro inside the room that investigators believed to be the source of the fatal shot. This revised account significantly strengthened the prosecution's reconstruction because it appeared to place two principal suspects at the location investigators considered central to the crime. In cases built largely upon circumstantial evidence, witness testimony often acquires enormous significance. A single statement can alter the perceived coherence of an entire investigative theory. For prosecutors, Aledo's revised testimony became one of the most important pieces of evidence supporting the case against Scattone and Ferraro. Yet it was precisely this testimony that would later become one of the investigation's most controversial elements. Years after the legal proceedings had concluded, recordings from portions of Aledo's interrogation became publicly known. These recordings revealed investigators applying intense pressure during questioning. According to later reporting and analysis, investigators warned her that she herself could become a murder suspect if she continued denying knowledge of the events. The existence of these recordings fundamentally changed public discussion surrounding her testimony. The issue was not simply whether her final statement was true or false. Rather, The controversy centered on the conditions under which that statement had been obtained. Critics questioned whether prolonged interrogation and the possibility of criminal accusations might have influenced her decision to alter her account. Supporters of the original investigation argued that pressure during questioning does not necessarily invalidate truthful testimony. Others countered that the circumstances demanded greater caution when evaluating the reliability of statements obtained after such intense investigative tactics. Importantly, these later criticisms did not overturn the court's conclusions, nor did they automatically prove that Aleto's testimony was inaccurate. Instead, they introduced lasting uncertainty regarding one of the prosecution's key evidentiary foundations. The debate surrounding her statements illustrates a broader issue extending far beyond this single case. Criminal investigations frequently depend upon witness recollections. Yet human memory is neither perfectly stable nor entirely resistant to external influence. Courts around the world have long recognized that stress, repeated questioning, and investigative techniques may affect how witnesses remember or describe events. The Marta Russo investigation became one example through which legal scholars and journalists examined these broader questions. As attention focused upon witness testimony, the forensic evidence also attracted increasing examination. During the original investigation, particles discovered on the windowsill of the reading room had been identified as suspected gunshot residue. Their presence strongly supported investigators' conclusion that the fatal shot had originated from that location. In the absence of the weapon itself, these particles represented one of the few pieces of physical evidence linking the room to the shooting. However, years later, independent forensic experts questioned whether those particles necessarily originated from a discharged firearm. According to their later analyses, the particles could instead have resulted from environmental contamination. If that interpretation were correct, then one of the central assumptions underlying the investigation, the precise location from which the shot had been fired, would become significantly less certain. The importance of this debate cannot be overstated. If the particles were indeed gunshot residue, then the investigators' reconstruction retained substantial support. If they represented ordinary environmental contamination, however, then the evidentiary value of the windowsill findings would diminish considerably. This did not automatically establish that the shot originated elsewhere, but it reopened discussion regarding whether investigators had become too confident in a conclusion that rested upon evidence capable of multiple interpretations. Another question gradually emerged alongside these forensic concerns. Had the investigation become too narrowly focused once detectives identified the reading room as the probable firing position? Later commentators argued that investigators may have committed themselves to a particular theory at an early stage and subsequently concentrated their efforts on gathering evidence consistent with that theory. This criticism did not accuse investigators of acting in bad faith. Rather, it reflected a concern familiar within criminal justice systems worldwide, the possibility of investigative bias, in which early assumptions unintentionally influence the interpretation of later evidence. According to these later analyses, alternative possibilities may not have received the same level of attention once the investigation centered upon the Department of Philosophy of Law and the individuals associated with it. Whether this criticism is ultimately persuasive remains a matter of debate, but its existence explains why the case continued attracting scholarly and journalistic interest long after the courts had issued their final rulings. Throughout the investigation, one fundamental question remained unresolved despite months of inquiry. Why would Marta Russo have been shot at all? Prosecutors ultimately did not establish a convincing explanation for why she specifically became the victim. They did not demonstrate why Giovanni Scattone, if responsible, would have fired the weapon. They did not establish why Salvatore Ferraro, if involved, would have assisted. Instead, the theory eventually accepted by the court differed significantly from the image of a premeditated assassination. Rather than concluding that Marta had been intentionally targeted for a specific reason, the court accepted that the fatal shot resulted from an act of extreme negligence rather than deliberate murder. This legal conclusion addressed the absence of motive by suggesting that the shooting did not require a carefully planned intention to kill Marta Russo personally. Nevertheless, for many observers, the lack of a clear explanation continued to leave important questions unanswered. Even if the shooting resulted from negligence rather than deliberate intent, how exactly had such negligence produced a fatal gunshot within a university campus? Without the weapon, without direct eyewitnesses to the shooting itself, and without a demonstrated motive, the investigation inevitably rested upon a network of inferences drawn from forensic interpretation, witness testimony, and judicial evaluation. Each individual piece of evidence contributed to the overall picture, yet each also became the subject of later examination. By the time prosecutors prepared their case for trial, the investigation had assembled enough evidence to proceed through the Italian judicial system. Legally, the focus would soon shift from discovering new facts to testing existing evidence within the courtroom. Judges would evaluate the credibility of witnesses, consider the significance of the forensic findings, weigh the absence of physical evidence, such as the missing firearm, and determine whether the prosecution had established criminal responsibility under the applicable legal standards. The investigative phase had produced answers sufficient to sustain charges, but it had also generated controversies that would follow the case into every subsequent stage of litigation. As the courtroom proceedings began, Italy was no longer watching merely an investigation into a tragic campus shooting. It was witnessing a legal examination of how certainty can be established when direct evidence remains limited, when critical testimony becomes disputed, and when the search for truth depends upon balancing forensic science, human memory, and the difficult task of interpreting events that no one appears to have fully witnessed. By the time the investigation moved into the courtroom, the case of Marta Russo had already become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in modern Italy. Years had passed since the fatal shooting on the campus of Sapienza University. Yet the central questions that had emerged during the earliest days of the investigation had not disappeared. Instead, they followed every participant into the judicial process. The prosecutors entered court believing that the investigation had identified those responsible through a combination of forensic findings, witness testimony, and the reconstruction of the events that had unfolded on May 9, 1997. The defense, meanwhile, challenged the strength and reliability of that reconstruction, emphasizing the absence of direct physical evidence and the unanswered questions that still surrounded the case. What followed was not a single trial ending with an immediate and uncontested verdict, but a lengthy judicial process that extended across multiple levels of the Italian legal system. Over nearly 6 years, the case passed through successive stages of legal review, reflecting both the complexity of the evidence and the seriousness of the issues involved. Every appeal required judges to revisit the record, examine the reasoning of previous courts, and determine whether the convictions were supported by the available evidence under Italian law. This prolonged process itself illustrates an important characteristic of the case. Unlike investigations resolved by an overwhelming body of direct evidence, the prosecution of Marta Russo's death required courts to evaluate numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence together rather than relying upon a single decisive fact. The legal proceedings therefore became an examination not only of what happened on the university campus, but also of how different forms of evidence should be weighed when certainty remains incomplete. Central to the prosecution's presentation was the investigative reconstruction developed during the years following the shooting. Investigators had concluded that the fatal shot most likely originated from the reading room on the second floor of the Department of Philosophy of Law. This conclusion rested upon the interpretation of forensic evidence, particularly the particles identified during the investigation as suspected gunshot residue discovered on the windowsill. The prosecution also relied heavily upon the testimony of Gabriella Aledo, whose revised statement placed Giovanni Scatone and Salvatore Ferraro inside the room that investigators believed to be the source of the fatal shot. Together, these elements formed the backbone of the prosecution's argument. Although no firearm had ever been recovered, no fingerprints connected a weapon to any defendant. No DNA linked an individual directly to the shooting, and no eyewitness testified to seeing the trigger pulled. Prosecutors argued that the combination of forensic reconstruction and witness testimony established responsibility beyond the legal standard required by the court. The defense approached the case from a fundamentally different perspective. Rather than attempting to explain every unanswered question surrounding the shooting, defense arguments focused on the limitations of the prosecution's evidence. The absence of the murder weapon remained one of the most significant issues throughout the proceedings. Without the firearm, many forms of forensic confirmation simply could not exist. Ballistic comparisons could not identify a specific gun. No physical object could be examined for fingerprints or biological traces. The inability to recover the weapon meant that the prosecution necessarily relied upon indirect proof rather than direct physical linkage between a defendant and the fatal shot. Equally significant was the absence of an established motive. The prosecution did not demonstrate why Marta Russo herself would have been intentionally targeted. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, there was no known personal conflict between the defendants and the victim. No documented history of hostility explained why such a crime would occur. This absence did not prevent the legal proceedings from moving forward. Since criminal responsibility does not always depend upon proving motive, nevertheless, it remained one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the case because it left the broader narrative of the crime incomplete. Courts often seek to determine not only who committed an act, but also whether the available evidence presents a coherent explanation of why that act occurred. In this case, that explanation remained limited. The testimony of Gabriella Aledo also occupied a central position throughout the judicial proceedings. Her revised statement represented one of the prosecution's strongest links between the defendants and the location identified as the probable source of the shot. At the same time, the circumstances surrounding her changing account attracted careful attention because they raised broader questions concerning witness reliability. Although later public debate regarding the recordings of her interrogation would become especially significant after the legal process had concluded, the issue of how her testimony should be interpreted already formed an important part of the courtroom discussion. The judges were therefore required to assess not merely the content of her statements, but their credibility within the broader context of the investigation. This task reflects one of the judiciary's most difficult responsibilities. Courts frequently encounter conflicting interpretations of witness testimony. Human memory is imperfect, and different parties naturally assign different significance to inconsistencies or changes in recollection. The judge's role is not to determine whether every witness remembers events flawlessly, but to evaluate whether the testimony, considered together with all other evidence, reaches the level required for criminal judgment. In the Marta Russo case, that evaluation became especially important because so much of the prosecution's theory depended upon evidence that required interpretation rather than direct observation. As the proceedings continued through multiple stages, another notable aspect of the prosecution's theory became increasingly clear. The legal conclusion ultimately accepted by the courts did not characterize the shooting as a carefully planned assassination directed specifically at Marta Russo. Instead, the court accepted a different explanation. According to the final judicial conclusion, the fatal shot resulted from an act of extreme negligence rather than deliberate, premeditated murder. This distinction proved legally significant because it addressed one of the investigation's most persistent weaknesses, the absence of a demonstrated motive. By concluding that the shooting occurred through grossly negligent conduct rather than intentional targeting, the court recognized that the available evidence did not establish a planned effort to kill Marta Russo personally. This conclusion did not diminish the seriousness of the offense or the tragic consequences of the shooting. Rather, it reflected the court's interpretation of the available evidence regarding the nature of the defendant's conduct. After years of litigation, appeals, and judicial review, the Italian courts reached their final decisions. Giovanni Scattone was convicted of manslaughter through gross negligence and sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in prison. The conviction reflected the court's determination that he bore criminal responsibility for the events leading to Marta Russo's death, not because the court found evidence of an intentional assassination, but because it concluded that the fatal shooting resulted from conduct constituting extreme negligence under Italian law. Salvatore Ferraro was convicted for assisting in concealing the incident. His conviction reflected the court's assessment of his role within the events examined during the investigation and trial. Francesco Liparota, meanwhile, ultimately followed a different legal path. After the appellate process, he was acquitted. His acquittal demonstrates another important aspect of lengthy criminal proceedings. Appeals do not merely confirm earlier decisions automatically. They exist precisely because appellate courts are tasked with independently reviewing legal reasoning and the sufficiency of evidence. In Liparota's case, that process concluded with a determination that he should not remain convicted. His acquittal, therefore, became part of the final judicial outcome alongside the convictions of Scattone and Ferraro. Nearly 6 years after the fatal shooting, the legal proceedings reached their conclusion. In 2003, Italy's Court of Cassation, the nation's highest court for criminal matters, issued the final judgment. Legally, the case had come to an end. No further ordinary appeals remained available. The convictions and acquittal established by the judicial process became final. From the perspective of Italian criminal law, the question of legal responsibility had been resolved. Yet even as the legal system reached its conclusion, a different conversation continued outside the courtroom. Final judgments possess legal authority, but they do not necessarily eliminate every public question surrounding a controversial case. In the years following the Court of Cassation's decision, journalists, legal scholars, forensic specialists, and commentators continued examining the evidence. They revisited the same issues that had shaped the investigation and the trial: the missing firearm, the absence of fingerprints and DNA, the lack of a clearly established motive, the reliability of witness testimony, and the interpretation of the forensic findings from the reading room. Their work did not alter the legal status of the case, nor did it reopen the judicial proceedings. Instead, it reflected an enduring distinction between legal finality and historical debate. A court must eventually decide whether the evidence satisfies the legal burden necessary for conviction. Scholars and journalists, however, often continue asking whether every available fact has been fully explained and whether alternative interpretations deserve further consideration. The Marta Russo case would become one of Italy's most prominent examples of this distinction. Although the courts had spoken with final authority in 2003, the broader discussion concerning the investigation's methods and conclusions was only beginning to evolve. The trial, therefore, accomplished two things simultaneously. It concluded the legal search for criminal responsibility through a final judicial verdict, and it established a record of evidence that later generations of researchers would continue to analyze. Every witness statement, every forensic report, every judicial opinion, and every appellate decision became part of a documentary record that remained open to scholarly examination even after it had become legally settled. This unusual combination of judicial closure and continuing public scrutiny explains why the Marta Russo case occupies such a distinctive place within modern Italian criminal history. It is remembered not only because a young law student lost her life under mysterious circumstances, but also because the legal process itself became a lasting subject of discussion regarding the evaluation of circumstantial evidence, the reliability of witness testimony, the interpretation of forensic science, and the challenges courts face when certainty remains incomplete. By the conclusion of the trial, the Italian justice system had delivered its answer. Whether that answer also resolved every historical question surrounding Marta Russo's death would become the subject of a new chapter, one driven not by judges and prosecutors, but by journalists, legal scholars, forensic experts, and a society that continued asking whether the complete truth had ever been fully uncovered. When the Court of Cassation delivered its final judgment in 2003, the Italian legal system had reached the end of its formal examination of the Marta Russo case. The appeals had been exhausted. The convictions and acquittal established through years of litigation became final. From a legal standpoint, the case was closed. In many criminal investigations, that moment marks the conclusion of public attention. Newspapers gradually move on to other stories, television cameras disappear from courthouse steps, and the names once dominating headlines slowly fade from national memory. Yet the death of Marta Russo followed a different path. Rather than disappearing from public discussion, it continued to provoke questions that neither the passage of time nor the finality of judicial decisions seemed capable of resolving completely. The years that followed demonstrated an important distinction between legal certainty and historical inquiry. Courts exist to reach decisions according to established legal standards. They evaluate the evidence presented before them, apply the relevant law, and ultimately determine criminal responsibility. Their judgments possess legal authority because every justice system requires finality. Without final judgments, no criminal case could ever truly end. History, however, often operates differently. Historians, journalists, legal scholars, and forensic experts are not bound by the same obligation to reach definitive legal conclusions. Instead, they continue asking whether every available fact has been fully explained, whether investigative assumptions deserve renewed examination, and whether the evidence supports only one possible interpretation or several competing ones. The Marta Russo case gradually became one of Italy's most discussed examples of this distinction. Although no official reinvestigation reopened the criminal proceedings, the case increasingly attracted the attention of individuals interested not in relitigating the verdict, but in understanding the investigative process itself. As years passed, discussion shifted away from simply asking who had been convicted and toward broader questions concerning how the investigation had unfolded. Legal scholars examined the methods through which the prosecution's case had been constructed. Forensic specialists revisited the interpretation of physical evidence. Journalists studied thousands of pages of investigative records and courtroom documents, rather than searching for sensational revelations. Many of these later examinations attempted to understand why the case had remained so controversial despite its legal conclusion. Their work reflected an important reality. Some criminal cases become historically significant not only because of the crime itself, but because they expose difficult questions about the administration of justice. The death of Marta Russo increasingly belonged to that category. Among the most influential examples of this renewed examination was the podcast series Pulvera, Il Caso Marta Russo, produced around 2020 by ethicist Chiara Lally and journalist Cecilia Sala. Their project did not constitute an official judicial proceeding. It did not introduce a new prosecution, present newly discovered suspects, or initiate another trial. Instead, it represented an extensive journalistic and analytical effort to revisit one of Italy's most debated criminal investigations, drawing upon tens of thousands of pages of case files and documentation. Lally and Sala carefully reviewed the evidence that had shaped the original investigation and subsequent court proceedings. They also interviewed individuals connected with the case, seeking to understand not only what investigators had concluded, but how those conclusions had been reached. The significance of Pulvera lay less in the discovery of new facts than in the careful reconsideration of existing ones. Rather than asking listeners simply to accept or reject the court's verdict, the series encouraged a more nuanced examination of the investigative process. How reliable was the forensic interpretation upon which the original reconstruction depended? How should witness testimony obtained after prolonged interrogation be evaluated? Had investigators remained sufficiently open to alternative explanations? Or had they become committed too early to a particular theory? These questions did not seek to erase the judicial record. Instead, they explored whether the record itself could be understood more completely through renewed analysis. One of the principal areas of continued discussion involved the testimony of Gabriella Leto. During the original investigation, her revised statement became one of the prosecution's most important pieces of evidence because it placed Giovanni Scattone and Salvatore Ferraro inside the room, believed to be the source of the fatal shot. Yet the later release of recordings showing the circumstances surrounding portions of her interrogation prompted continuing debate regarding witness reliability. The issue was never simply whether Leto intended to tell the truth. Rather, commentators asked whether the methods used during questioning might have influenced the evolution of her testimony. Modern criminal justice systems frequently confront this difficult issue. Investigators naturally seek complete and accurate information, particularly in serious homicide cases. At the same time, prolonged questioning and psychological pressure can become subjects of later scrutiny because they raise concerns regarding the independence of witness recollections. The Marta Russo case therefore contributed to broader conversations extending well beyond Italy. It became part of an international discussion concerning investigative techniques, memory, and the complex relationship between truth and human recollection. The forensic evidence likewise remained an important focus of later examination. During the original investigation, particles found on the windowsill of the reading room had been identified as suspected gunshot residue, supporting the theory that the fatal shot originated from that location. Years later, however, independent experts questioned whether those particles necessarily resulted from the discharge of a firearm. They suggested that environmental contamination represented another possible explanation. This debate illustrates how advances in scientific understanding and renewed forensic review can influence public interpretation of historical criminal cases. Importantly, these later criticisms did not establish that the original forensic conclusions were incorrect. Neither did they produce definitive proof supporting an alternative reconstruction. Instead, they demonstrated that the interpretation of physical evidence may remain open to legitimate scientific discussion even after legal proceedings have concluded. Such debates remind us that forensic science often involves probabilities rather than absolute certainty, particularly when investigators must interpret limited physical traces in the absence of more direct evidence. Another enduring topic of discussion concerned the investigation's overall direction. Some commentators argued that detectives may have become strongly committed to the theory that the Shot originated from the reading room and subsequently concentrated on evidence supporting that. Conclusion. According to this criticism, alternative possibilities might not have received equivalent consideration once investigators had identified what they believed to be the most likely firing position. This concern reflects a phenomenon recognized within many legal systems, sometimes described as the danger of becoming overly attached to an early investigative hypothesis. The criticism does not necessarily imply misconduct or bad faith. Rather, it recognizes that investigators, like all human beings, may naturally interpret later information through the framework of conclusions they have already reached. Whether that occurred in the Marta Russo investigation remains a matter of continuing debate. Nevertheless, the discussion itself has become an important part of the case's historical legacy because it encourages reflection upon investigative methodology in complex criminal inquiries. Perhaps the most persistent unanswered question remained the simplest one. Why? Throughout the investigation, the trials, the appeals, and the years of subsequent analysis, no convincing motive emerged explaining why Marta Russo herself became the victim. The court ultimately accepted that the fatal shooting resulted from an act of extreme negligence rather than a deliberate assassination, thereby acknowledging the absence of evidence demonstrating an intentional effort to target her specifically. Yet even that legal conclusion left observers contemplating the extraordinary randomness of the tragedy. A young law student walking through her university campus lost her life without any established personal conflict explaining the event. For many people following the case, that absence of motive transformed the crime into something even more unsettling. Crimes motivated by revenge, greed, or hatred possess their own horrors, but they at least provide a narrative through which people attempt to understand what happened. The death of Marta Russo resisted such explanation. The lack of an established motive meant that the tragedy continued to feel disturbingly arbitrary, reinforcing the sense that an ordinary day had been shattered by an act whose underlying purpose remained uncertain. Decades after the shooting, the legal outcome remains unchanged. No official reinvestigation has overturned the convictions, ordered a new trial, or identified different suspects. The Court of Cassation's judgment continues to stand as the final legal resolution of the case. This distinction is essential. Public debate, scholarly criticism, and journalistic investigation have all contributed valuable perspectives, but none has altered the formal legal status established in 2003. The difference between questioning an investigation and reversing a conviction is profound. The Marta Russo case demonstrates how a criminal judgment may remain legally settled while continuing to inspire legitimate academic and public discussion regarding the evidence upon which that judgment was based. In this sense, the case occupies a unique position within modern Italian legal history. It is remembered not only because of the tragic death of a young university student, but because it became a continuing examination of how justice systems operate when certainty is incomplete. It asks difficult questions without always providing definitive answers. How much weight should courts assign to circumstantial evidence when direct physical proof is absent? How should judges evaluate witness testimony that evolves during prolonged questioning? How should forensic evidence be interpreted when later experts suggest alternative explanations? At what point does an investigation become so committed to one theory that other possibilities receive insufficient attention? These questions extend beyond a single courtroom or a single country. They touch fundamental principles of criminal justice shared by legal systems around the world. Perhaps that is why the Marta Russo case continues to resonate decades after the events of May 1997. It reminds us that criminal investigations are conducted by human beings working under immense pressure, often with incomplete information and limited evidence. They must make decisions that cannot be postponed indefinitely, even when every uncertainty has not been eliminated. Courts, in turn, must evaluate that evidence according to legal standards rather than philosophical ideals of absolute certainty. Their responsibility is to determine whether the available proof satisfies the requirements established by law, not whether every conceivable historical question has been answered forever. Yet for society, history often remains more complicated than legal judgments alone. People continue reading case files, listening to investigative podcasts, and revisiting forensic reports because they seek not merely legal closure, but intellectual understanding. They hope to comprehend how tragedies occur, how investigations succeed or struggle, and how justice systems confront uncertainty. The story of Marta Russo ultimately belongs to all of these conversations. It is a story about a young woman whose life ended unexpectedly while pursuing her education. It is a story about investigators attempting to reconstruct an event that no one appeared to witness directly. It is a story about courts weighing imperfect evidence over years of litigation before reaching legally binding conclusions. And it is a story about journalists, scholars, and forensic experts who continued asking questions even after those legal conclusions became final. Through every stage of that journey, however, one truth has never changed. Before the debates over forensic particles, before the arguments regarding witness testimony, before the appeals, the podcasts, and the scholarly analysis, there was a 22-year-old law student named Marta Russo. Her future ended on an ordinary university morning that should have resembled countless others. Everything that followed, the investigation, the courtroom battles, the continuing public discussion, and the enduring historical interest, began with that irreversible human loss. Whatever conclusions individuals ultimately reach regarding the evidence, the legacy of the case should first remind us of the value of the life that was taken and of the continuing responsibility shared by investigators, courts, journalists, and society itself to pursue truth with both rigor and humility, recognizing that justice depends not only upon reaching decisions, but also upon the willingness to examine how those decisions are made. The story of Marta Russo has no hidden final chapter in which a forgotten witness suddenly appears, a missing weapon is recovered, or a courtroom dramatically reverses everything that came before. It ends in a far quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling manner. The legal system reached its conclusion, yet the search for complete certainty never did. That distinction is what continues to make this case resonate decades after the events of May 1997. For some observers, the judgments delivered after years of litigation represented the careful application of Italian criminal law to the evidence available at the time. For others, the unanswered questions surrounding the investigation remain too significant to ignore. Neither perspective changes the undeniable fact that the legal process has ended. The Court of Cassation's decision remains in force, and there has been no official reopening of the case leading to a new trial or new defendants. Yet history often remembers cases not because every question has been answered, but because some questions never stop being asked. The Marta Russo case occupies precisely that place in Italy's collective memory. It has become less a story of a single criminal investigation and more a lasting discussion about how truth is pursued when certainty cannot be fully achieved. Looking back across the entire chronology of the case, one theme appears repeatedly. Every major turning point depended upon interpretation. Investigators interpreted the physical evidence collected inside the Department of Philosophy of Law. They interpreted the suspected gunshot residue discovered on the windowsill. They interpreted witness statements that evolved over time. Prosecutors interpreted those findings as supporting criminal responsibility. Defense lawyers interpreted the same evidence as insufficient or unreliable. Judges interpreted the totality of that evidence through the framework of criminal law. Years later, journalists and scholars interpreted the investigative record once again, asking whether alternative explanations deserve greater attention. The facts themselves remained largely unchanged, but the meaning assigned to those facts continued evolving as different people examined them from different perspectives. This reality illustrates an important lesson about complex criminal investigations. Contrary to popular portrayals in fiction, evidence rarely speaks for itself. Physical traces require scientific analysis. Witnesses require credibility assessments. Circumstantial evidence requires logical reconstruction. Courts do not merely collect facts. They determine how those facts relate to one another. In cases where direct evidence is limited, that process inevitably becomes more difficult and more vulnerable to disagreement. The Marta Russo investigation demonstrated exactly how challenging that task can become. Consider the elements that remained absent throughout the proceedings. The firearm believed to have fired the fatal .22 caliber bullet was never recovered. Without it, investigators could not perform the ballistic comparisons that often provide decisive forensic confirmation. No fingerprints connected a recovered weapon to any suspect because there was no weapon to examine. No DNA established direct physical contact between an individual and the firearm. No eyewitness testified to watching the fatal shot being fired. No convincing motive explained why Marta Russo herself would have become the victim. Each missing element forced investigators to rely more heavily upon the evidence that remained. As one category of proof became unavailable, the significance of every other category naturally increased. This shift did not automatically invalidate the investigation, but it did ensure that each remaining piece of evidence would bear greater responsibility within the overall reconstruction of events. Among those remaining pieces of evidence, none generated more lasting discussion than witness testimony. The controversy surrounding Gabriella Aleto's statements continues to attract attention because it highlights one of the most difficult issues confronting criminal justice systems everywhere. Human memory is extraordinarily valuable, yet it is also remarkably complex. Investigators depend upon witnesses because many crimes cannot be solved through physical evidence alone. At the same time, psychologists and legal scholars have long recognized that memory may change under stress, repeated questioning, or the passage of time. The recordings later released from Aleto's interrogation did not establish that her testimony was either true or false. Instead, they encouraged broader reflection about investigative methods and the circumstances under which witness statements should be evaluated. Those questions extend well beyond Italy. Around the world, courts continually balance the necessity of obtaining truthful testimony with the obligation to ensure that investigative pressure does not compromise the reliability of what witnesses ultimately say. The Marta Russo case, therefore, became part of a much larger international conversation concerning the relationship between memory, interrogation, and justice. The forensic debate surrounding the suspected gunshot residue similarly illustrates the evolving nature of scientific evidence. During the original investigation, the particles discovered on the windowsill supported the conclusion that the fatal shot originated from the reading room. Years later, independent experts proposed that environmental contamination represented another possible explanation. This later criticism did not conclusively disprove the original forensic interpretation, just as the original interpretation did not permanently prevent future scientific discussion. Instead, the disagreement reminds us that forensic science, like all scientific disciplines, advances through continuous examination and reevaluation. New techniques, improved understanding, and independent review frequently lead experts to reconsider earlier conclusions. Such reconsideration should not automatically be viewed as evidence that previous investigators acted improperly. Rather, it reflects the normal process through which scientific knowledge develops over time. Another enduring lesson from the Marta Russo case concerns investigative focus. One of the questions raised by later commentators was whether investigators became committed early to the theory that the fatal shot had originated from the Department of Philosophy of Law and subsequently concentrated on confirming that hypothesis. This concern reflects what many criminal justice professionals recognize as a potential challenge in complex investigations. Early theories often guide later decisions because investigators must allocate limited resources efficiently. The danger, however, is that a promising theory can gradually become the lens through which all subsequent evidence is interpreted. Whether that occurred in the Marta Russo investigation remains a subject of continuing debate. Nevertheless, the discussion itself has become an important educational example for legal scholars examining investigative methodology. It encourages future investigators to remain attentive to alternative possibilities even after developing a strong working hypothesis. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the case is that its central mystery has always extended beyond the courtroom. The judicial process answered the legal question of criminal responsibility according to the standards required by Italian law. It could not, however, eliminate every uncertainty that existed outside those legal standards. History often demands explanations that law is not always capable of providing. Why did this tragedy occur? Why Marta Russo? Could every relevant possibility truly have been examined? These questions belong partly to philosophy, partly to history, and partly to the natural human desire to understand events that appear senseless. Unlike legal judgments, they do not always admit final answers. Around 2020, the renewed examination presented through Polvora, Il caso Marta Russo demonstrated that interest in the case had evolved rather than disappeared. The project undertaken by Chiara Lalli and Cecilia Sala reflected a broader cultural shift toward carefully re-examining controversial historical investigations through documentary analysis rather than sensational speculation. By reviewing tens of thousands of pages of records and interviewing individuals connected to the case, they encouraged listeners to distinguish between what was established, what remained uncertain, and what continued to provoke legitimate discussion. Importantly, their work did not produce an official reinvestigation or alter the legal status of the convictions. Instead, it reinforced the idea that historical inquiry and legal finality often exist side by side without necessarily contradicting one another. One provides binding judicial resolution. The other encourages ongoing reflection about how that resolution was reached. In that sense, the Marta Russo case continues to serve multiple purposes. For lawyers, it represents an example of how circumstantial evidence may be assembled and evaluated through multiple levels of judicial review. For forensic specialists, it illustrates the importance of carefully interpreting physical traces and remaining open to scientific reassessment. For journalists, it demonstrates the value of returning to historical cases with patience, documentation, and respect for factual accuracy rather than sensationalism. For students of criminal justice, it offers an opportunity to examine the strengths and limitations of investigative processes conducted under enormous public pressure. Above all, however, it remains a profoundly human story. Long before legal arguments, forensic debates, and documentary podcasts entered the picture, there was a young woman whose life ended unexpectedly while walking through her university campus. Marta Russo never became famous through choice or achievement. Her name entered public consciousness because an ordinary morning transformed into an irreversible tragedy. Every legal document, every appellate ruling, every forensic report, and every later analysis exists because that single moment occurred. It is easy, especially after decades of discussion, to become absorbed by questions of evidence and procedure. Those questions matter enormously because justice depends upon accurate investigations and fair trials. Yet they should never overshadow the individual at the center of the case. Marta Russo was not merely a legal subject or a historical controversy. She was a 22-year-old law student whose future ended before it had truly begun. The continuing debates surrounding the investigation should therefore be understood not as abstract academic exercises, but as efforts to ensure that criminal justice remains worthy of the people it is meant to serve. Every discussion about investigative methods, witness reliability, forensic interpretation, or judicial reasoning ultimately points back to a single responsibility: the pursuit of truth with honesty, precision, and humility. The Marta Russo case reminds us that certainty is not always attainable, but integrity in the search for certainty must always remain the goal. Decades after that quiet morning at Sapienza University, the campus continues to educate new generations of students. Classrooms are filled once again. Hallways echo with conversations about examinations, careers, and the future. Life has continued, as it inevitably does. Yet the memory of May 9th, 1997, remains woven into the history of that institution and into the broader history of modern Italian criminal justice. It stands as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is rarely simple, that evidence must always be examined with care, and that behind every criminal case lies a human life that cannot be restored. The verdict may be final, but the responsibility to learn from the case endures. That, perhaps more than anything else, is the lasting legacy of Marta Russo. What follows instead is something more subtle: the way a closed legal case continues to live inside public memory, academic discussion, and journalistic inquiry long after the courtroom has finished speaking. In that space, the case of Marta Russo gradually transformed from a criminal proceeding into a reference point, a lens through which broader questions about justice, uncertainty, and the limits of proof are still examined. When the legal system reaches finality, it draws a line beyond this point. No further judicial decisions will be issued unless extraordinary circumstances arise. But history does not draw such clean lines. It allows cases to remain active in thought, even when they are inactive in law. The Russo case exists precisely in that tension between closure and continuation. On paper, the outcome is fixed. Giovanni Scattone and Salvatore Ferraro were convicted in relation to the events surrounding the shooting, while Francesco Liparotta was ultimately acquitted after appeals. The Court of Cassation's 2003 ruling stands as the definitive legal conclusion. No higher authority exists within the Italian judicial system to revisit those decisions under normal conditions. And yet, despite that formal closure, the case never fully settled into silence. Instead, it became part of a wider intellectual landscape in which scholars, journalists, and legal analysts continue to ask what the case reveals about the nature of evidence itself. One of the most enduring aspects of this post-judicial phase is the continued examination of how certainty is constructed in cases without direct physical proof. The Russo investigation did not produce the kind of evidence that typically anchors homicide prosecutions. No recovered firearm, no definitive ballistic match, no clear eyewitness account of the shooting, and no established motive explaining why the victim was targeted. Instead, the case rested on a combination of circumstantial reconstruction, forensic interpretation of disputed particles, and witness testimony that itself became a subject of controversy. In later discussions, this combination is often described not as a failure of investigation, but as a challenge inherent to certain types of crimes. Some events simply do not leave behind clean, unambiguous traces. They must be reconstructed from fragments, each requiring interpretation. What makes the Marta Russo case particularly significant is not that it lacked direct evidence, but that a legal system was required to reach a conclusion without it. This is where the case continues to generate discussion long after its legal end. Scholars examining the investigation often return to a fundamental question. At what point does a collection of circumstantial evidence become strong enough to justify a conviction beyond reasonable doubt? Different legal cultures answer this differently, and even within a single system, interpretations evolve over time. The Russo case is frequently used in Italian legal education as an example of how evidentiary chains are constructed, and how fragile those chains can appear when each link depends on interpretation rather than direct observation. Another dimension that continues to attract attention is the role of witness testimony under pressure. The case of Gabriella Aletto remains central in this discussion, not because her testimony alone determined the outcome, but because it illustrates the complexity of memory under investigative conditions. Her initial reluctance to provide incriminating statements, followed by later changes in her account during prolonged interrogation, became one of the most debated aspects of the case record in later academic and journalistic analysis. This episode is often examined not as an isolated controversy, but as part of a broader question about how investigative environments shape what witnesses say. The existence of recorded interrogations added further layers to this discussion, allowing later observers to analyze tone, duration, and pressure in ways that were not publicly visible during the original trial years. These materials did not overturn the legal outcome, but they contributed to an ongoing reassessment of how testimony should be weighed in cases where physical evidence is limited. Parallel to this is the continuing debate over forensic interpretation, particularly the particles initially identified as gunshot residue on the windowsill of the reading room. At the time of the investigation, this evidence played a significant role in supporting the theory that the shot originated from that location. In later years, however, independent experts raised questions about whether those particles necessarily indicated a firearm discharge, suggesting instead that environmental contamination could not be excluded. This scientific disagreement illustrates another key theme that emerges from the case. Forensic evidence is rarely absolute in isolation. Its meaning depends on context, methodology, and the assumptions used to interpret it. What was once presented as a supporting pillar of the investigative reconstruction later became a subject of reinterpretation. Not because the physical evidence changed, but because its scientific framing was reconsidered. The absence of a recovered weapon remains perhaps the most structurally important feature of the case. In many homicide investigations, the firearm provides a tangible link between suspect and act. It can be tested, analyzed, and compared. In the Russo case, that link never materialized physically. The weapon, if it existed in the manner assumed by investigators, was never found. This absence did not prevent a legal conclusion, but it ensured that the case would always rest on indirect inference rather than direct confirmation. For later analysts, this raises a persistent methodological question. How should justice systems treat cases where the central physical object of the crime is missing entirely? Is inference sufficient when carefully constructed? Or does the absence of that object inherently weaken the reliability of the overall conclusion? The Russo case does not provide a single universally accepted answer, but it forces the question into view with unusual clarity. Over time, the case also became a reference point in discussions about investigative focus. Some commentators argue that once the reading room was identified as the most likely origin point of the shot, the investigation may have narrowed its attention too decisively around that hypothesis. In this view, Alternative explanations may not have received equal exploration once a dominant theory took shape. Others counter that narrowing focus is a necessary part of any complex investigation, especially when resources are limited and decisions must be made based on evolving evidence. What makes the Russo case particularly interesting is that both interpretations can coexist without fully displacing the other. The same sequence of investigative decisions can be understood either as a logical narrowing of possibilities or as an early commitment to a framework that shaped subsequent interpretation of evidence. This duality is part of why the case continues to be studied rather than simply remembered. In contemporary Italian discourse, the case is no longer primarily discussed as an active controversy requiring resolution. Instead, it functions as an analytical case study in law schools, journalism programs, and forensic seminars. It is examined not to determine guilt or innocence. Those determinations are legally fixed, but to understand how investigative narratives are built, challenged, and sustained over time. The enduring interest in the case also reflects a broader cultural reality. Certain crimes remain present in public consciousness not because they are unresolved in court, but because they remain unresolved in meaning. Legal systems are designed to produce decisions. Human curiosity often seeks explanations that go beyond those decisions. The gap between those two aims is where cases like Marta Russo's continue to exist long after the final judgment. Ultimately, the significance of the case does not lie in a hidden revelation waiting to overturn history. It lies in its stability. The facts, as established by the courts, remain fixed. The interpretations, however, continue to evolve. That tension is what keeps the case alive in academic and public discussion decades later. It is not a story that continues through new events, but through new readings of old events. And in that sense, the final lesson of the Marta Russo case is not about what was proven or unproven in a courtroom. It is about how societies continue to search for clarity even after the law has already spoken, and how some questions persist not because they lack answers, but because the answers themselves invite further reflection.